Okay, you're good to go.
That's great. So hello, everyone. I'll be presenting the second chapter with a different title. I misspelled this one. There will be many misspellings throughout the presentation. Please don't hesitate to point them out at the end. I was in a rush, so please excuse me. It's also a very, there's a lot of small things he kind of hints at, and I had a little bit of troubles with kind of figuring out what I should mention, what I shouldn't. So maybe we can also, perhaps somebody was really interested in a small paragraph that he kind of goes off the main red line and then of the main path argumentative, and we could also then you can say, oh, maybe I wanted to discuss that, and when I wanted to hear something about that specific paragraph there, which I probably won't mention. So basically, he's going to be, Dupuy in this chapter is going to be discussing the two foundational texts of cybernetics. The first one written by Rosenbluth, Wiener, and Bigelow, and the second one by McCulloch and Pitts. And then also kind of trying to finish the mechanization of the human he started in the previous chapter. So if we start with the first foundational article, he a little bit describes how all the people met. So Wiener and Bigelow, please excuse my pronunciations, so many names. They were designing aircraft defenses during the Second World War together, for which Wiener developed a probabilistic theory of prediction. And after the war, in collaboration with Rosenbluth, they noticed that there was a deep analogy between conceptualization of this anti-aircraft defense systems and the process of work in the voluntary movement of a human subject. And of course, this paper was a result of this collaboration. In it, they introduce some key concepts for cybernetics, such as information, communication, organization. But all of the concepts remain somewhat obscure, especially they're defined with vocabulary that it might not be accepted in later stages of cybernetic thinking. For example, the concept of feedback is defined as the return of energy of the output to the input. This concept of the notion of energy seems very foreign to later texts on cybernetics. And of course, it starts with similar presuppositions of as behaviorism does. So they explicitly define their first objective as to define the behavioristic study of natural events and to classify behavior being described or defined as any modification of an object detected externally. So the presuppositions are there. The presuppositions that are there are very behavioristic. However, they managed to still find another way, not simply this singular connection between stimulus and response. They do that by employing the notion of feedback, which makes the object, enables the object investigated, or enables the explanation why the object investigated is capable of changing the relationship that it has established between input and output, between stimulus and response. This, of course, kind of introduces, one could also define or do away with the concept of teleology, since it seems to be very close to it. Of course, what happens is that the concept of signal that was used by behaviorists changes into the concept of information used by cyberneticians. And of course, what we get here that the machines investigated by cybernetics are not merely trivial machines, as Förster put them, but non-trivial finite state automatons. Of course, at this point, Dupuy asks himself how we should understand cybernetics, because it's often assumed that cybernetics was or is somehow a new science, a rival to physics, because it abstracts from the content, from material content in which physics is supposed to be interested in. However, Dupuy is things that actually this is not so. but it merely kind of develops a unified model or a theory of machines and living creatures. And it's therefore merely an extension of scientific modeling that we saw in the first chapter. So not a new science, not a new way of abstracting, just merely on a new phenomenon, one could say. But still, this ignoring internal contents seems very important for cybernetics. And why is it so? So Dupuy illustrates this question, this problem, with the interaction between Herbert Birch and Rosenbluth. So Birch was a biologist, I think, and he wanted to distinguish mere behavior from true communication. Since he thought that if we consider an interaction between starfish and scallop, where starfish comes in scallop's vicinity and the scallop takes flight, it would be really weird to call this communication. Since Birch presupposed that true communication, as he called it, really needed to be based on the concepts as, for example, intentionality, anticipation, and similar. What Rosenbluth countered was that behavior is actually the only form of interaction we can have with another system. So it's very, very suspect to involve these all internalist notions while trying to define the fine line between mere behavior and true communication. So what Dupuy says that actually they're developing, cyberneticians are trying to develop a eliminativist notion of mind, doing away with common folk psychology terms, as beliefs, desires, wills, intentions. And they, of course, should be, these terms should be banned from scientific explanations, since they are not detected, they cannot be detected externally. The only thing that can be is behavior, by definition, as we saw before. Okay, there's also a second foundational article that Dupuy focuses on. This article can also appear a little bit to go in a different direction than Wiener, but Dupuy is convinced that actually it's a radicalization of what Wiener and colleagues, so Rosenbluth and Bigelow, did and wrote about. So the aim of this paper is actually to find a neuroanatomical and neurophysiological basis for synthetic a priori judgment, that is logical deductions, basically. And McCulloch and Pitts are try to find a logical material mechanism and mechanisms that embody mind. Now, this might seem, the mind as a concept that we were dealing with in the last chapter. Of course, it might seem that brain in this context, as where these mechanisms supposedly reside, could be considered as the inside content of the form of the mind. But Dupuy says that actually things are a little bit more complicated, since the small units out of which brain is built, so these idealist neurons, as we'll see quite soon, these units themselves are without an inside. So actually brain should be considered as a structure formed out of many smaller units that are actually that subscribe to this division between content and form, since they are not concerned with their own content. So if we compare Wiener's and McCulloch's positions, we can see that Wiener was a very thoughtful applied mathematician, and he did not consider the analogy between machines and living beings as something that is ontologically very important. Whereas for McCulloch, it is actually the most important thing. Namely, what he writes is that everything we learn of organisms leads us to conclude that not merely that they're analogous to machines, but that they are machines. So there seems to be this development of a deeper ontological position regarding the relationship between living beings and machines. Now, another aspect of this difference might also be that when Wiener is talking about machines, he means real machines, real mechanical systems that we encounter in our everyday life. Whereas McCulloch, when he talks about machines, he means mainly logical machines. And of course, this citation now points out this distinction very nicely, since the man-made machines are not brains. So that's what Wiener would agree with. But brains are a very ill-understood variety of computing machines. So there's another notion of machine that we're concerned with, and actually that's the notion that gathers together both man-made machines and brains. And of course, cybernetics has helped pull down the wall between the great world of physics and the ghetto of the mind. That's a quote taken from one of the McCulloch's articles. So we can say that McCulloch identifies model with the ontological reality that it's supposed to model. So if we summarize, cybernetics is not making the machine human, it is rather mechanizing the human. And it is not a rival to physics, but an imitation and extension of it. At this point, I noticed it would be really interesting to point out a discussion we had last time. Somebody invoked this definition of a model, namely a model is an abstract form that is embodied or instantiated by phenomena. And then it was said that if one constructs the economical model and implements it in a machine, an economical model of inflation, the result would not really be inflation itself, but merely a model. So there has to be a more complicated relationship between a model and a phenomenon. What we have to consider here actually, and I think this becomes more and more apparent, that is that the phenomena taken by as objects to be investigated by cyberneticians are already heavily modified. We saw in the previous chapter that they could start investigating human thought only after it has been already formalized and set off in the way of logical mathematical logic, which of course developed before independently of cybernetics. What I mean to say is that the phenomena is much more artificial than perhaps inflation in that sense. And as we'll see also with the example of neural networks, actually the phenomena often come after the model that is supposed to model them. Okay, if we now complete the beginning of the mechanization of the human that Dupuy set out to explain, historically explain in the previous chapter, we have to be aware that they're not merely two actors, as he says, not merely an organism and a machine, but three actors: the structure, the brain, the function, the mind, and the model, the machine. And to really completely mechanize the human, we have to proceed in three acts. First, as we saw in the previous chapter, we have to equate the function of the mind with the function of a machine, with a model of a machine. And we did, cyberneticians did, and mathematicians did that with the notion of Turing machine. And as we saw with the whole development of mechanical procedures and mathematical reasoning. We'll see now that Dupuy adds to this a master thesis written by Shannon as a completion of the way of showing the equality or equivalence between mind and a machine. Now, the second act of this mechanization would be to equate the brain, so the structure, with a machine. Now, this is going to happen, we already seen a little bit of it, with McCulloch's and Pitt's advancements in modeling neurons. And the third act will be to equate the machine to machine, so a physical machine to a logical machine, which will be done by von Neumann. To complete the first act, we have to turn to Claude Shannon's master thesis. He wrote it at 21. I've heard that it was the most important master thesis of the century, or last century. Basically showed that the Boolean algebra could be used to analyze automatic phone exchanges, and automatic phone exchanges could be understood in terms of Boolean algebra. So basically what he said, what he did is he showed that the equation that was developed in the previous chapter, so that the mind is a logical machine, was extended to the equation that mind was actually also physical, could be considered a physical machine. Now, McCulloch and Pitts took inspiration from Shannon and actually tried to do a model of structure of the human brain more closely informed by biological facts. So they tried to construct a quasi-anatomical or physiological logical machine that perhaps is equivalent. They tried to make it equivalent to a Turing machine. They did not succeed, as we'll see. What was of an interesting importance for them is to solve, of course, age-old philosophical questions, as the question of the relationship between the soul and the body. They did that, but by merely taking the equation of the brain with the machine, of the mind with the machine, and adding their own model of the brain, and that the brain is a machine, and concluding that actually this simply explains that the mind is equal to the brain, since they're both equal to a logical machine and a physical machine in the end. Now, how did they do this? How did they manage to prove that a brain could be equal to a machine? They defined brain as a network of idealized neurons, and idealized neurons as elementary arithmetic calculators that compute a logical function of their antecedents. We see that it is very heavily inspired by the all or none way of considering logical gates in the logical type of model that Shannon developed, which of course was a step forward from the predecessors who merely applied the systems of differential equations describing interaction between neurons. That's why actually they managed to do this step by this step of constructing a model of a brain that was closer to a Turing machine than their predecessors. But they did not really succeed in making it completely equivalent to a Turing machine, or they succeeded in creating a finite state automaton, which is a subset of a Turing machine. What they lack is actually the two parts of the Turing machine, namely the heads, and most importantly, the infinite tape or memory. Since the brain is infinite, of course, it cannot compute everything a Turing machine can. So they failed in what they set out to do. Nevertheless, the neuron became a model. And as a model, it got a life of its own. But first, it was constructed out of a close relationship with biological, physiological, physical interpretation. So McCulloch wanted to avoid psychology by transforming biology into experimental epistemology. So what he actually did, he tried to create an idealized neuron that would express the essence and only the essence of the physical neuron. He understood this neuron in a similar way that chemists understand the concept of atoms. He writes, the postulated neurons, for all their oversimplifications, are still physical neurons as truly as the chemists' atoms are physical atoms. So if you try to find an idealized neuron in the brain, you would not succeed, but actually describing the brain with the neuron, there should be no problem, because all the additional properties of physical neurons are merely contingent and do not belong to the essence of the neuron itself. Since it became a model, it became used in artificial intelligence. And of course, we know today this as neural networks, as connectionism, as we'll see next slide. But one of the first applications of this model in the field of artificial intelligence was Frank Rosenblatt's perceptron. How does one pronounce that? So it was capable of learning and recognizing patterns. We don't really need to do this. Okay, so in terms of the relationship between connectionism and cognitivism, Dupuy suggests that they could be considered in 4 different ways. But why is this question of the relationship even important? I think that because they share a common origin in this trying to model human thinking as a computation. Of course, connectionism, neural networks, defines thinking as a parallel emergent computation, whereas, as we've seen in the previous chapter, cognitivism defines thinking as merely symbolic computation, unidirectional computation. What the four options are: segregation, to really have connectionism on its doing its own, solving its own problems of pattern recognition, and cognitivism investigating the problems it can solve. We can say that connectionism is merely a implementation of cognitivism on a neural system, such as human brain. We can say that we can translate between them freely, so they're equivalent, or we can say that actually connectionism is better or closer to the truth than cognitivism, and thus cognitivism could be merely a limiting theory, much like Newtonian classical mechanics is a limiting theory of Einstein's theory of relativity. And the last step of the mechanization of the human was to show that actually the machine we were equating mind to, not human, but mind to, and then brain to, could also be equated to a physical machine. We haven't had that before. So we start this third act with the ENIAC, the machine developed Second World War. It was used for calculating problems in the Manhattan Project and some weather stuff, also artillery tables for the military. But basically it was built with no hardware, software, and by extension, content form distinction. Of course, John von Neumann came and he abstracted this distinction between hardware and software. And he showed that a physical machine could be understood as a logic machine. But this he could do only on the basis of the McCulloch's machine and how they solved important problems he was faced with. So the same way McCulloch and Pitts took inspiration from Shannon, now Neumann took an inspiration from McCulloch's machine. And he developed, John von Neumann, an Izak, a sequential machine that we know today as computer. Now, I wasn't sure, for me, we could finish here. I wasn't sure about how to discuss this behavior part that comes after this, how to incorporate it into everything else. But it has to do with the relationship between McCulloch and Neumann. But if we just skip that, maybe somebody else can supplement my presentation in this regard. To me, there are two important questions. One I already mentioned. So what is a phenomenon in relation to its model? What would it mean that a phenomenon is constructed only after the model was already invented? So that we can either model existing natural phenomena or we can create new phenomena from an existing models. Would that somehow impact how we understand the relationship between models and phenomena? I think there are also interesting connections here with French historical epistemology and so, for example, Canguilhem or Cavalier, where a technical construction of a phenomenon, of a scientific phenomenon, for example, a model organism in a lab, is as important as the subsequent abstraction into a model. So it's not that we simply go into a forest and pick up a fox and then investigate it, but that we really have certain technical ways of constructing the phenomena that we can even investigate. And of course, this question relation between quality and equivalence. is it important to see where it's merely an equivalence, so a isomorphism between machines, an analogy between machines and living beings, and where there's really kind of metaphysical ontological equality between models and phenomena. Yeah. So that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Izak. This was actually a really good, really nice presentation. Very concise, I would say, with regards to the main points, and also you've covered basically the whole chapter and nicely. So thank you for that. So shall we maybe start with the discussion? I think that Izak brought out some really good points, and they actually are in line with some of the things I jotted down as well. I have the impression that we will be circling around modeling again, which is probably nice for Andrea and some other people in the research project. But yeah, I don't want to take the lead here. So if anybody would like to chime in and start off this discussion, and then we can maybe take it in different directions. No volunteers with regards to that. Also, by the way, before we continue, we really need to also discuss if the hour, this particular hour, new hour, is okay, because I see that quite a lot of people are not present. So I don't know, maybe Daria is not able to come. Do you know, Andrea, if this is the case? And
she has some family business.
Okay. So it's not like a systematic thing.
No, it's not a systematic thing. So
okay.
she thought that she could make it, but in the afternoon she said no, she has to see her.
Okay. Because also I have to check with Timotei and some other people. Maybe they didn't even know. Gregor, did you want to say something, or did you just turn on the cam?
I just turned the camera back on.
Okay. Look, then I will just start the discussion, and we see if we can go in different directions. So for me, this question of modeling was very interesting, and I would be really happy also if at some point, Andrea, you could maybe just outside of this particular text, just say that, you know, given the fact that you and Daria are one of the foremost researchers in the philosophical field of modeling, just to give us, like, you know, what the usual distinctions are. So what the model means, how is it related to theory, stuff like that. But before we go into this, I was thinking about modeling, and I was thinking about it in terms of the book I'm currently reading, which is this book. You won't be. It's by Gregory Bateson, Mind and Nature. Okay, Gregory Bateson is a figure that will be cropping up in this particular text as well. He was one of the second order cyberneticians, a really interesting person, as many other people are in this particular movement. But anyway, there's a section in this book where Bateson talks about distinctions between description and explanation. And he refers the distinction between these two to tautologies. And I was thinking that maybe as an interesting entry point into this discussion, the interesting entry point into this discussion might be if I just briefly present what he has to say about these things, and then we can see whether this is somehow interestingly related to modeling. Okay, is that an okay proposition? Yeah. Okay. Bateson's description and accounts are loose enough to allow for a lot of debates, but they are also kind of interesting in many ways. So he says that, you know, there is a very important distinction between description and explanation, and that for some reason within the context of science, explanation usually has the upper hand. They always seems that the explanation adds a certain something to description. So he doesn't really provide clear definitions of what he means by this, but he says something like a pure description. A pure description would be something that would include all the facts, that is to say, all the effective differences that are immanent in the phenomena to be described. So you have a certain phenomenon, and there are implicit ways that you can differentiate this phenomenon, both within itself and with other phenomena. And the absolute totality of these differentiations, implicit or explicit, would be like a pure difference. Yeah, description. Okay, now the way he describes, I found this part interesting, especially for the modeling. The way he describes explanation, he says that what happens in explanations is that you basically take a certain part from the description and you translate it, or you put it into a certain tautological system. So you have a certain tautological system, which is basically a system of propositions that are mutually interrelated. And what you do is you take a certain part of the description and you basically map it onto a tautology. He says that an explanation is a mapping of the pieces of description onto a tautology, and an explanation becomes acceptable to the degree that you are willing and able to accept the links of the tautology. If the links are self-evident, then the explanation built on that tautology is satisfactory to you. That is all. It is always a matter of natural history, a matter of the faith, imagination, trust, rigidity, and so on of the organism, that is of you or me. So there are certain tautological systems that you can construct and where specific propositions imply each other. So they are, in a certain sense, yeah, logically, how would you call it, complete, in the sense that, you know, they are literally tautological. And these models you use in a way where you basically map certain aspects of your description into these tautologies, and these tautologies then seem either acceptable or not. And according to Bateson, the way this is done is basically, as he says, a matter of natural history. So it's a matter of faith, imagination, trust, rigidity, and so on and so forth. But even if you don't take this into account, I found this interesting because first question for me would be, are models always explanatory? So what is the relationship between explanation and modeling? Because if I understand this correctly, you construct a model because you want to have an explanation of certain phenomenon. You do not just want to describe it, you want to have an account of it. You want to understand it. You want to know how certain aspects of a given phenomenon interrelate among each other. So you need some sort of a system, some sort of a tautological system, as he calls it, or a logical system, a certain structure of propositions that will allow you to interconnect specific aspects, or that would allow you to bring forth certain aspects of this description. So, okay, the first question is the model always explanatory? And does what I've just said make sense? And then we can also get to what Izak was saying, because Izak introduced another aspect, which is how the technologies that we have basically open up a field of phenomena that you can then construct explanations of. But I think that this first aspect has more to do with description than with explanation. But anyway, so what do you think of this differentiation? And maybe Andrea can also first just say what models usually, how are models understood, how are they differentiated from theories, and then we can take it from there and try to bring this debate to what cyberneticians were doing with the mind.
Okay, I think, you know, you are just asking too much here. So that's, maybe we can rather become a little bit more concrete. So what you say about models and explanation, I think explanation is a big word. So I would say that you use models to gain some understanding about a phenomena. And I think for me, it's somehow, it's crucial to accept, but which Ty and I also, I think in the last last week or last 2 weeks, tried to point out that our knowledge about the phenomena is always limited. Otherwise, we wouldn't construct a model. So that, you know, by the matter of fact that we construct a model to understand the phenomena where we only have partial understanding of, we don't know it in all its details, and we have particular questions we are asking. So we are also somehow, you know, construct the phenomena. It has some constructiveness in it, because just by the matter of fact that we construct the model to ask these kind of questions. And I think this is nicely pointed out by, I have to get here by Izak, was pointed out by Izak in his presentation. And in the end, when he asked a question about McCulloch and Pitts, and if we take the example of McCulloch and Pitts, I mean, you know, as far as I always understood McCulloch and Pitts, they started out to build these networks, and because they wanted to have to implement logic. For them, logic was the main thing, which gave them, you know, the framework by which they could approach, you know, processes in the brain, or in the brain. But, you know, by reducing it to these kind of network structures. And, you know, I think here you see very much this constructive aspect, right? You know, that you have these neurons which can be either on or off, you know, and how they are connected, if they are, you know, if you have random connections or not random connections, and the kind of, and if you look at the dynamic, you know, what kind of phenomena these kind of network would produce. And then you have to go back to the, you know, you get a phenomena, but this phenomena is not directly linked to the brain. So it's more like you have to take this, it's a kind of detour. I think this modeling practice is very, it's more complicated than Dupuy. It's describing it. He always talks about representations and isomorphism in the book. And this, I think it's a too simplified picture of what's going on when you model. Does this make sense?
Yes, it does. I would maybe add a couple of things here, and maybe then you or somebody else can say a few comments about this. So we would probably agree that the reasons why models are used is, as you said, so that we gain a certain understanding, that is to say a certain understanding of phenomena. However, I would claim that the modeling approach to knowledge, or to put it differently, to understanding, presupposes a very specific type of understanding. You cannot acquire any type of understanding by constructing models. If you construct models, you are looking for understanding in the form of explanation, which means that you have a certain phenomena that you are taking into a different vocabulary that allows you to articulate certain correlations within that phenomenon from a very specific perspective, where these correlations and relations have a certain form, which then can be used also in different contexts. So basically, you have a very specific way of understanding what understanding means, and it means explanation in the sense of trying to formalize relations whereby contents themselves are not important, or they are of secondary importance. There are different types of understandings where somebody might claim, no, contents are important, and all the formal relations are always embodied in a very specific setting. So when you do this, what you're doing, you are in a certain sense doing a very specific thing. So I think that what Bateson is calling explanation fits very nicely to what, for the most part, science is doing when they're constructing models. They are trying to gain an understanding that is a very specific type of understanding. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is I agree with what you described as these, I would call these looping effects. So once you have a model, this model eventually gets fed into the description itself. So the model and its implications become reintegrated in the phenomenon described in a certain sense. and it changes profoundly. So when you then develop another model, in a certain sense, it has to take into account this. So you get these loops which are strange. Ian Hacking, you probably know him. Ian Hacking was talking about these looping effects, which are crucial for human beings. So where you basically describe a certain phenomenon and give it a certain name, you construct a model of it, and then this phenomenon changes in virtue of the model that you've constructed, because it has acquired a new way of for example, self-identifying or self-understanding or what have you. This is especially prominent in for example, the humanities and social studies. So if you give a label to a certain set of phenomena, then the phenomenon will change, because, for example, if you give a name to a certain group of people, these people will start thinking about themselves in terms of the new model that you've constructed. So before, they were not fugitives, now they are fugitives. So all of a sudden, they start thinking about themselves differently and behave differently. Or, for example, you might construct a model about a certain illness, and people, certain mental illness, start behaving differently because there's this new category and this new model that they can use to self-identify. And by doing so, they change, because previously they weren't behaving like this. So these are nice examples where you have these looping effects. Now, it depends to what degree this also holds true, for example, for natural sciences, but we are now precisely in the region that is in between, because you have the mind, which is precisely the phenomenon that is like there. So these are the two things. One of the things that the notion of understanding and modeling is a specific way of what it means. So it's a specific understanding of understanding. That's one thing. And the second thing is the looping effect is, of course, very real and has to be taken into account. But the question is what exactly this means, where you have a certain concrete description of phenomena, and then you construct a model, and this model feeds into this construct concrete. It becomes embedded into it, especially via technology that enables, for example, or something like that. So
then I would ask, what kind of explanation do you get in the end? I mean, for me, I always understood McCulloch-Fitts network in such a way. So even if they made assumptions about, or they had a hypothesis about the neuron, that you can, model a neuron, as Izak said, the essence of the neuron is that it's firing, it's not firing, it's on or it's off. And so this is clearly it's an assumption, and they had any empirical proof of if this is really the case. This only came later. So with these models of Hodgkin and Hodges, but this was not the case with McCulloch-Fitts. So I really have a problem here with this notion of explanation. So why do we have to talk about explanation when in the end it gives us, one could say, it's a possible explanation. But it's not necessarily that, that the brain is exactly, wired up in this way. It would be, would be really disappointing if we would have such simple networks in our brain as McCulloch-Fitts were describing it.
Okay, Andrea, I understand what the issue for you is. Okay, so according to Bateson, it's not like when he talks about explanation, when you have this mapping of a certain segment of description onto a tautological system, that this is just like, you have one thing and that's it. He says you can do it in almost countless ways. That's precisely the point, because you can have so many different tautological systems. So you can construct a lot of different tautological systems and you can use them as your explanatory mechanisms, but some will seem more appealing or less appealing. And he says that there are a lot of contingent factors also that play in this, that play a role in this process. However, unfortunately, he doesn't really go deep into this. It's just, so for him, it's not like when he says that this is an explanation, it's the explanation. No, for him, it's like explanation merely means that you are capable of approaching a certain phenomenal realm from a certain formal realm, and you can establish some sort of a mapping from one to the other. But this can be done in many different ways. So
it's more this semantic tradition. That you have many different models, which allow you to provide some kind of explanation for one phenomenon.
More in that direction, yeah.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. So maybe that was the stumbling block for you at the very beginning when I was talking about explanation. So it's not the explanation.
Okay. Good. So maybe Gregor has he turned his camera.
Gregor.
Yeah, like I found the discussion just now very insightful, because it was exactly what we had talked about a bit in the last session. And having read a bit ahead, I knew we would be coming back to the notion of modeling and how it comes into play here a bit. And one of the key sentences of this chapter 2 now, I find, was on page 63, where also here it was now less a question of logical modeling and more a question of exploring capabilities of a class of complex networks made up of simple interaction mechanisms on page 63. It's also what you Sebastian just highlighted, like this idea of exploring capabilities and maybe not so much explaining a particular phenomenon, but just now moving to look at the artificial structure or logical structure we have of these basic elements and see where it takes us functionally. Was some of the ideas that also is very close to my obsession with structure-function relationships, but also a crucial element here that it kind of stopped trying to reconstruct an existing system, but really getting a life of its own. Like we can look what it is capable of if we have certain basic elements organized in this way. So maybe it's also a shift there in not trying to model the mind as it is in very mechanistic terms, put something together as a model of that thing, but rather now play around a bit more for other capabilities. Is that maybe along the lines of this chapter and where this everything's going a bit?
Yeah, Izak.
Yeah, I actually realized what I wanted to say about the behavior in the end, because that's exactly what happens in von Neumann's understanding of behavior. So he has this argument with McCulloch about how to describe behavior, whether to describe it as a just in a finite amount of words, as McCulloch wants, or to describe the structure that produces the behavior. And this structure, of course, is a neural network. So basically what happens is that the description of the phenomena to be investigated gets kind of turned on its head. So description is not a description that is independent of the model, but actually comes out of the model itself. So as Dupuy writes, it's meaningless under these circumstances to discover that such behavior can be embodied in a neural network. So it is not possible to define the behavior other than by describing the network itself. So exactly as you said, Gregor, it's basically they're playing around with this model, and then something pops up and say, oh, this is similar to that specific faculty we've encountered in our everyday life. But it's kind of the relationship between every life and model gets inverted.
This is marvelous. I was actually thinking also what I said before with Ian hacking. So, for example, this idea and this what Andrea said in the meantime reminded me of this. So, you know, when you have a mind and then you construe it in a very specific way, and if you have these looping effects where you basically, here's the problem, here's the potential problem. You construct a model, yeah, and the model provides a certain explanation that might be extremely useful and that may lead to, like Izak just now said, to a lot of new interesting explorations. So it can feed back into the realm of phenomena and open up domains of phenomena, and you can do a lot with it. But the problem is precisely this move that happened between Wiener and McCulloch, where you have that when Dupuy talks about the radicalization, where you have the model that becomes ontologized. And this is the problem, especially because it's done implicitly often. What this means is you construct a certain model and you ontologize it, and then you give off the impression that what you are doing is basically you are somehow accounting for reality. And then, because this model it's useful, becomes prominent, starts spreading around, for example, because you're trying to account for the human minds, human beings start thinking of themselves and their minds through the lens of computation and through the lens of hardware and software distinction. And then basically you kind of, you know, because there's a feedback loop where the model feeds into the phenomenon to be described, you are constantly rediscovering the same thing. You're saying, yeah, for sure. Because after all, the scientists themselves understand the things that they are doing through this particular perspective. So they see what they expect to see. And even the subjects themselves eventually think about their cognition in those terms. So basically the mind becomes something that is determined or defined by computation. And computation nowadays is becoming like a key term with which you're basically trying to account for cognition. All the other terms, for example, if I, as a philosopher, enter the debate and I say, but, you know, in the Greek philosophy and in medieval times, what you will find is that mindedness is more closely related to something like transcendence, where you are able to break through specific models that you find yourself in and reposition yourself in something else. And in contemporary debate, people will be just like, they don't know what to do with that. For them, it's like, what are you even saying? Yeah. So certain models become so entrenched in what you see in the specific novel Lebenswelt that you become a part of, that, you know, certain words just lose a certain meaning. So when you try to say maybe cognition is something else, it's really difficult to even convey what you're saying. Yeah. Or if you want to, for example, say this has now changed a little bit, but if you want to say add an affective or emotive element to cognition. In the past, this was like almost, you know, it made no sense. But at the same time, there was no really intelligent account of what it means to have a certain affective state or something like that, and how it could be related to cognition. I don't know. I hope that I delineated what I meant by this looping effect, how it can then start feeding in on itself via the bridge of ontologization. But anyway, Andrea.
So maybe just one more word to McCulloch and Pitts. What I was really interesting in this reading is what made me think about these two guys again was that, you know, this ontologizing it was something which was done by McCulloch. And Pitts, he was the one he was a logician. So I have the feeling that, you know, there was a particular kind of tension between the two. So I think that for Pitts, he was more in this exploratory mode, and he was convinced, you know, that there is some kind of computation going on in the brain, and you can use logic. For him, logic was the basic element. And, you know, McCulloch wanted even to take it a step further. I think, you know, Pitts stayed in this formal realm, and McCulloch, you know, went in the direction of biology. And what you just said about that, you know, these models get a life of their own. So how they become, you know, discussed and taken up by others. When I did my diploma thesis in neural networks, so McCulloch and Pitts were still around, but it was a very condensed version of McCulloch and Pitts. McCulloch and Pitts was just logical networks, and, you know, and these neurons, these 0-1 neurons, are referred as McCulloch and Pitts neurons. So the whole discussion of, you know, what was going on at that time and what was the intention totally disappeared. But what was taken up was neural networks is something, you know, which you can describe like this, but the neural network was not, you know, in any way related to the brain or any processes people would seriously think are taking place in the brain. It was just a model which you could, you know, produce some kind of effects, some kind of pattern recognition or whatever you wanted, but it got somehow, you know, disconnected over the time. So I found this interesting, and maybe it also helps to understand, you know, how these models, how they, you know, as they say nicely, have the life of their own.
Yeah, I also think that at a certain point, stakes start becoming very high. So when you get a certain model going, and if you manage to apply it or utilize it very successfully in different domains, and then all of a sudden you see that you can build bridges between certain domains, then the inertia becomes extremely strong. So the unwillingness to let go of this becomes extremely strong. I think that Rosenblatt, or who was it, Rosenberg or someone said, it was talking about a computer gestalt. So that, you know, after a while, what happened was that a computer gestalt developed. And I like this way of phrasing it, because gestalt, you know, is in a certain sense, it talks about what is given to you as a meaningful whole in a way where you almost cannot see it differently. So yeah, you open your eyes and you see computers, you see chairs, you see stuff like that. You could basically differentiate your reality in numerous, countless, myriad different ways, but you are immediately given certain gestalten. And this is what happens. So after a while, what you get is a new cognitive gestalt. And what Izak was presenting, so once you get this idea where you do two things and you bring them together, you say mind is a machine. And you're able to do this by saying mind can be exhaustively accounted for by propositional calculus, and you have a propositional calculus at hand. And Boole, for instance, he was unable to do this. So when you read his text, which is, again, a very readable text, very interesting text, he was just laying the foundations, and he wasn't able to carry this through. But it was interesting in principle. Wow, maybe mind could be accounted for by propositional calculus. Maybe it can be accounted for in this particular way. And then you show that propositional calculus can be embodied in certain mechanical devices. Wow, that's interesting. And then you have the brain and you say, maybe I can describe the brain as these particular mechanical devices that embody a propositional calculus. And all of a sudden you have very different domains, and you have a certain something that can potentially combine them. And you start looking things in this way, and they become so visceral and so organic, they become gestalten, you really have difficulties getting away from. If somebody comes and says, but look, mind is not just, you know, a symbolic computational something, they will be like, well, what is it then? What is it that transcends it? And you say, mind is transcendence. And they're like, you're not even talking like a proper philosopher or scientist. What the heck is this? You know, we're not in the time of Plato. You know, go and kind of sit down a little bit and breathe a little. This doesn't make any sense. So it is just like this very profound visceral inertia, yeah, and this incapacity to see things differently for this particular reasons that start to develop. I find this aspect so interesting. And the final thing that I would like to say with regards to this is, then 100 years pass and people look back at these gestalten and they're like, how the heck could they take this so seriously? What was it with them? How could they be so naive? Just like we look back now and look like certain models, and how could they be taken so seriously? And this is the problem. How do you, you know, kind of break through this and have the capacity to see the models as they are and the function they operate without necessarily falling into the pitfall of ontologizing them because they morph into specific ways of seeing things? And here is where the transcending aspect of the mindedness enters the picture. Yeah, so these are some reflections on these.
And just one last comment. So what you said about this, you know, that about the gestalten, that you can, you know, you just see it that way, you know, how it is described in these models. So it became even more complicated when people saw that also magnetic systems are in the same way, you know, that you also have, you know, the spin is off and on, and they even mention it here in this chapter. So they became modeled in the same way. So there was all these kind of grouping of different phenomena, which had been modeled by the same model, or became modeled by the same model. And, you know, this is what Taya and I call these model templates. And, you know, I think one reason why people are doing this is very pragmatic, because this was something they could explore. You know, mathematically, it was, you know, approachable. You could do mathematics with it. You could get to results. And I think this was one of the driving forces, which people often don't see, you know, how important this is for doing science. You know, if you have a model, it can be as nice as it would be, but if you can't do anything with it, it's worthless.
So any other thoughts or reflections so that we don't have a dialogue here? Izak, maybe you?
I'll try to say something, yeah, but I don't know if it's going to be comprehensible, intelligible. No, I was thinking about what both of you said with regards to, on the one hand, ontologizing the models and taking them very seriously in a research, in the context of a research program. But then to me, another question is, if we take them seriously outside of it. To me, it often seems, I don't know, I was playing a little bit around with ChatGPT, and I was really expecting a lot, and then I was really disappointed. It basically can't do anything. And to me, this is first an example of how perhaps in terms of a research program of simulating text or simulating, I don't know, coding, for example, and it can do pretty well, but then you find out that it does quite some mistakes, and you have a lot of bugs when you program with it. So that's already a big problem for me, because in terms of a research program, it's a great thing, but in terms of everyday life, it's kind of, you very soon realize that it's not that's amazing. I was reminded about the discussion around imaginary numbers, complex numbers in the, 16th, 17th century in England. So basically everybody was arguing whether or not they should accept them and they should consider them real numbers. There were a lot of people who were opposed to them. They said, no, all the numbers have to be nominalist in a sense. They have to be able to exist. You have to have 3 apples, or to lack 3 apples. You can't have like, I don't know, a perpendicular number of apples. Not possible. But then this guy Wallace comes along and he says, yeah, but actually everything is imaginary. Like, even if you take negative numbers, it's imaginary. If you take a big numbers, it's imaginary. So basically, we don't really have to discuss it that much. Everything is imaginary. It's really useful. So I don't know why you're arguing. So if you wanna have a perpendicular number of apples, it's actually, you're the one at fault, not the model itself. So, and that's the point where everybody started saying, oh, maybe, yeah, we should kind of understand this model and do a lot with it, but within a specific system, specific research program, not having it outside. And to me, I'm always struggling with, when I talk to scientists, I think we talked a lot about this, Sebastian, that on the one hand, to me, it seems that a lot of the times when when you speak to them about their own discipline, a lot of the times, especially if they're big research scientists, they're not really very well convinced of the ontological reality of what they really do, of the supreme importance, metaphysical importance of their research programs. And actually that shows. Wiener does the analogy. McCulloch is the one that says, oh, the brain is a logical machine. When he's not a logician, he's kind of doing logic, but not being a logician. So he's kind of an outsider. For me, that's very interesting, and how actually outsiders are the ones that propagate these naive extensions of models, whereas the true scientists, true experts actually stay in their lane and just say, yeah, it's your fault if you extend it too far. Just a thought.
This is very interesting. Just a minor addition. So either people from the outside, or the next or the third generation within the same line. So for example, you know, when you have a development of a certain something that is very novel, that is almost like a qualitative shift within science. So let's use the most prototypical example, quantum mechanics. You have the founders of quantum mechanics, all of them had an extremely nuanced philosophical position on what they were doing. Like none of them were naive with regards to, yeah, this is just reality or something. They just couldn't do it. 30, 40 years later, I mean, still you had like the distinction between instrumentalists and between realists, but somehow more and more of these ideas about, well, reality is just very strange. It's very quirky, as if, you know, what quantum mechanicists are doing are presenting the reality, which just turns out to be very strange. So, and this is also, for example, then becomes so much sedimented within the physics itself, who are then doing other stuff towards which they have this tentative and cautious approach. But it becomes entrenched where you think like, I mean, for the most part, my impression is that they still have this tendency to see what natural science at large is doing has something to do with ontology. I wouldn't say that this is not the case. It is just what they are doing usually with regards to models that they are working. They're so deeply involved in their developments and all the quirks that are related to it that they simply cannot take it upon themselves to say, well, this is reality. Come on, they know how messy it is. They're writing papers about it. It's like everything is tentative. So you either need an outsider who just looks at it and says, like McCulloch, well, okay, the brain is, you know, this machine, and let's proceed in this manner. Or after a while, you have a development of a certain gestalt, which is so, I'm using this again, this word, but becomes so entrenched that after a while, you just don't bother with it. Or as Latour would put it, the science in action becomes the fully accepted science. So what is being developed in certain stage becomes the black box. You don't think about it anymore. It's just there, and it's just part of the reality that you're operating with. So it becomes sedimented, it acquires a life of its own, and it becomes an item in the ontology of the world you're operating in. So I would say that, you know, that would be my take on this particular thing.
I think in that sense, neural networks would be a counterexample to the history you just showed. At least that's how I understood Andrea. So there was this McCulloch guy who was a naive ontologizing prick. And then in 3 generations, people came, and now people come and say, yeah, basically, we're just trying to figure out how we can simulate text generation or image recognition. It's not about figuring out the ontological reality of the human cognition. So in what sense would this then, to me, this is a reversal of what you've just described, that actually the founder of the field is the most naive one. And the farther it progresses, the more conscious of what they're doing, really, they become.
I would say that the physicists were in line with what Andrea was saying. But for example, once you get into the field of, once the neural idea started to penetrate into the neuroscience as such, it was slowly becoming more and more ontologized. So the idea is now that basically the brain is like a huge neural network, extremely complex one, maybe in principle even unmodelable, but that we can somehow, by these idealized, we are approximating a certain something that is basically a reality of sorts. So I would say that the ontologization definitely did happen, but probably it depends on the field. I think that the physicists, I don't know, Andrea, were you working with physicists or with biologists, or who were the people who are doing the modeling?
Oh, I was a physicist. So so we were in the physics department. So we started, you know, we did neural networks, but mostly based on, we were referring to McCulloch and Pitts and John Hopfield, but at the same time, we also were referring to work in physics on spin glasses and magnetic systems. So, but I know that also in the, there are these neuroscientists, but I think it's different, on the one hand, you have the model, and this is what I meant, this model became so, so omnipresent. So everybody was taking this model and, you know, some kind of variations of the McCulloch and Pitts model, a little bit more complicated and, you know, putting in some more parameters, but, you know, and on the basic, it was still the McCulloch and Pitts neural network they were using. And on that side, you had this, you had the neuroscientists who, you know, who had, you know, different approach. They were looking into, you know, into the brain, or, you know, try to understand what's going on there on the neurophysical basis. But and they had this, what you described, this idea that there are networks, also neural networks, but much more complicated, much more complex. So on the one hand, you had this group of scientists more really working in neuroscience with you know, and on the other hand, you had these physicists who, you know, had all the freedom, you know, to take this very abstract model and play around with it. So I think these are two different directions in which this went, and this ontology, you know, the physicists were not taking any ontologies or were talking about ontologies. For them, it was just a model.
Nice. Yeah, that's.
I hope this answers a little bit.
Yeah, this is very useful because it got me thinking. The physicists were basically straddling different disciplines, and for that reason, it was probably easier for them to just accept the just model idea, because you literally saw how you could use the same formal framework for very different phenomena. And you weren't basically kind of taking the idea of, yeah, well, I'm describing the reality of this particular phenomenon seriously. You just realized, you know, I'm using a complex set of tools, formal tools, mathematical tools and whatnot, technological tools to a certain degree, and I'm kind of using them to, in a certain sense, almost like play with different phenomena and see if I can make sense of this. So it's easier then to keep this distance, I guess, even if you don't reflect too much about it. But if you have a certain model and you're just working on one thing, and then you get this identification happen sooner or later. Yeah, well, you know, what I'm describing now, that's basically how this particular thing is structured and how it operates, and I'm describing in a certain sense. So I don't know, maybe that could be part of the game as well.
Yeah, I think that, you know, it became even, you know, Taya and I, we call these kind of models, you know, like McCulloch and Pitts, and later on then these Hopfield model. These are kind of model templates, you know, which you could take and you could apply them to various phenomena and explore them and try to gain some kind of understanding, because you make the assumption there is some commonality between these different systems. But, you know, not saying that, you know, this model is really representing. It's more also, you know, this idea of that it delivers, you know, techniques and mathematical techniques and concepts, and which you might find useful. And on the other hand, what you could observe is that, you know, kind of that physicists went into neuroscience and wanted to make, you know, apply their models in neuroscience, which made the whole situation much more complex. And, you know, the models started to change, and then hadn't been these kind of, I don't know about the best describe, you know, they lost this component of being very abstract model. They had to deal with the materiality at the moment when they went there. So it's a really interesting dynamic, which you can see what's happening with these models.
That's really interesting. One thing that I was also thinking about, and this is related to what Izak was mentioning when he was talking about the importance of technology. So, you know, and as he pointed out in the French epistemological tradition, you have this, one of the things that's emphasized is the significance of different technologies, techniques, and how these techniques themselves basically are not just the result of a certain something, but they open up the domain of possibility for modeling to even happen. So it's not like, you know, you have theories and models and then you have techniques based on that. But so one of the things that I found interesting here is this. I don't know if I'll be able to describe this, but so you develop a certain model to account for a certain phenomenon. And once you have this model in place, it allows you to engage with the phenomena in different ways. So in novel ways, in many, that's one of the reasons why we find models so interesting, because all of a sudden, because it underscores certain relations, you can approach a certain phenomenon from a certain aspect, and this allows a certain mode of engagement with it. Now, the interesting thing is that this mode of engagement eventually produces a certain amount of techniques and technologies, which usually start undermining the very model itself. So it's almost like a pet, like a child that undermines its parent, where, for example, and I like this is something that I found interesting in this debate between McCulloch and von Neumann. Because Neumann was he was an interesting character. On the one hand, he kind of was very much rooted in what was being developed there, like these distinctions between software and hardware and formal and, you know, what's happening. But at the same time, he was also extremely prescient, where he had this idea that, can we really just ignore the things that we ignore when we idealize and formalize stuff? I mean, they might not seem important given the techniques that we have available now, but are they truly trivial? So, and the thing is, so hear me out, you have a certain model which you develop with a certain specific set of techniques that you have available. And this certain set of techniques and the models that are related to them, they ignore a lot. But because of this new model that you've developed, a new set of techniques starts developing, which allows you to bring into the picture precisely the things that you were ignoring before. And this undermines the very model and allows you to supersede it. So it's like an ongoing dynamics between the modeling technique. And I just find this loop very interesting, where basically the model undermines itself eventually. I don't know, maybe also the topic of models being necessarily static and the domain of phenomena being necessarily dynamic enters the pictures as well. But yeah, I find this idea interesting. How the question of complexity, which seemed to be, well, it's not really important, you know, you have a biological system is way more complex than these idealized neurons, but it's not really important. And then it turned out, well, no, once you have a certain level of complexity, system starts behaving very, very differently. So all of a sudden, what was trivial before becomes non-trivial, and to the degree where it basically starts undermining the model that actually allowed to a certain degree to you to even get to the point where you saw that complexity is important. So this is something that's potentially also quite interesting about the nature of models and the relationship to the world of to the domain of phenomena and techniques or activities, engagements with phenomena. So any thoughts on that? Izak, I know that you're quite heavy on this. So, and also Andrea, you had practical experience, so that would be also interesting.
And why don't you go first, Izak?
I don't know what to say. I mean, an example came to mind, the molecular dogma, the dogma of molecular biology, the unidirectional nature of information transfer, which was a great way to formalize experimental procedures when Creek introduced it. But nowadays it's really not useful anymore, because it enabled a way of understanding and experimenting with different systems, so that it showed also the wish to prove the universe, the presupposition of the unidirectional nature was what pointed out the divergences that came to mind in the end, like Prounce and like other systems. Perhaps Gregor can say more about this. I just
I mean, the central dogma is a topic all for itself, but I don't want to divert too much. But yeah, I share your impression that it has lost a bit its centrality, and the debate also about the counterexamples like reverse transcriptase, and it's people only use it as a very it's a schematic or a kind of model in a very liberal way that has outlived its importance for a theoretical core or something like that. But still, it's in every textbook still up there. That's a very interesting case.
So how would it fit, in your opinion, in what we were discussing about the ontologization of models?
I think it captures nicely the spirit at the time to think a lot of like a linear code, and also a bit along the lines of a Turing machine, a bit to have the ribosome like that. And it had its day, but for research nowadays, other models have taken the bright spot.
So I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but just for the propriety's sake, Pia, if you have any ideas or comments, you're more than welcome to join the discussion. This is not something that needs to happen, but if you do, so that you don't feel that like if you don't say anything, I'll just presuppose that you prefer to listen. Okay, so are there any further, Andrea, did you want to maybe add something to this relationship between modeling and technical intervention, and then models basically pulling rug underneath their own feet?
Yeah, I like this this example of the central dogma Izak was pointing out. That's even we know that some of the models, like this McCulloch-Pitt model, and also the Lott-Gavottera model, and all these kind of models, we know that they are limited, and but they stay. You find them in every textbook, and scientists are still somehow referring to them as saying, this is the basis of the model. So they're not really, I just try to think about a model which as you say, what was pulling the carpet. I cannot, somehow I think if models had been successful in what I find is that somehow, a lot of these models, or what we describe as model templates, they stay on.
Yeah, but here's the thing. Here's what I think. So let me give you a concrete example. What I mean by what were the things that I was saying. So you have a certain, let's say, conception of what it means to compute, and then this is kind of used as a template for cognition. And after a while, within the very domain that was created on the foundation of this particular model, you get another view, the parallel view, the connectionist view. And basically, if you take this model seriously, computation starts meaning something very different from what it was meant in cognitivism. However, the notion will stay, only it will become equivocal. So you might say, well, yes, the previous theory is still there, because you still use the same terminology, you still have this idea that somehow this is related to computation, and because it is related to computation, it is related to a computer. But if you look at the domains closely, what happens is that you have a huge transformation of the whole domain. Only the terms become very equivocal, so you use them in very specific ways. And this is something I find happens a lot. So for example, you would have biology, and you will have the central dogma. And for the most part, the things that are starting to happen is they all point in the direction where the central dogma is still not there. I mean, that it doesn't hold true, at least in its most simple and fundamental way of looking at it. But you will still have certain terminologies and certain concepts and notions that were introduced, but they start acquiring a very different meaning. So that the very dogma itself allowed for a very specific way of engaging with phenomena, which eventually started kind of pulling the rug under the definitions of the very model that brought them forth, and eventually forced this model to undergo a certain transformation. So another example, within the physics, right? After the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics and later dynamics complex systems, I can't see how anyone can still think in terms of the mechanical systems in mechanisms. But still, you know, the idea that somehow it is related to machines and it is related to mechanisms and whatnot is still present. But if you press the people, if you push them, they will say, well, yes, now we understand machines differently. But, you know, that's just like a terminological solution. In a certain sense, your concept of machine has changed to the degree where the machine basically denotes something completely else, but you feel that you're still part of a tradition because you use the same concept, even though epistemologically and ontologically, it's like a completely different ballgame. So, you know, I would say that the models do constantly pull the rugs underneath themselves. Do they live archaeological evidence or just, you know, sediments behind them? Sure. And this is inescapable. And it's also to a certain degree frustrating because you have semantic transformations that are basically still anchored in very specific terms that are used and can be very central. We still use the term of mass, and it means something very, very different than it meant in Newtonian physics, to the degree that it's almost like, why do you even use this term? So I don't know if this makes sense, but I'm trying to say that even if you have certain models terminologically, they are transcended in the sense of that they, except for playing an important pedagogical role in textbooks, they are no longer being used by physicists themselves. But they do, in a certain sense, still impact the way they think in larger terms about the reality as such. But within the domain that they're working, they are no longer being used. By the looks on your faces, this didn't come across as particularly clear, I've noticed.
No, it's clear what you're saying. So I just try to, I mean, this is yeah, sure, this example of mechanics and relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and that this concept of mass has, you know, has changed. But yeah, it's the same with Euclidean geometry. You know, we know that, you know, we have different kind of geometries. We have curved spaces, we have Minkowski geometry and all this kind of stuff. But we still think in terms of Euclidean geometry because, you know, for the most purposes in life, it's okay. You know, as long as I don't want to do relativity theory, I'm fine. And I think the same it's true for mechanics. You know, I think these concepts, you know, the meaning of the concepts depend very much on the context in which they are used and how they are used. Or do I understand you totally wrong there? Yeah.
No, I think that you understood me correctly. Maybe one last thing that I would add here is like a Fleckian point. So within a given society, within a given collective, you have a loopy relationship between what scientists are doing and the society at large. So scientists develop certain models that slowly penetrate into the society at large, And the models on the scientific side change very quickly, and it takes a longer time to become for them to get into the society at large and become sedimented there. But once they're sedimented there, they also impact the scientists themselves, because they are also like human beings that live in everyday life. So Ludwig Fleck has a really cool way of talking about this. He says the following: so you have a scientist who's working on a certain field, in a certain field, and he's being the topmost researcher in that field. And when he's working in that field, he knows how messy it is when you're developing a certain model and whatnot. So that scientist will always be very cautious, very careful about that particular field, like Izak said. So he will not ontologize what he's doing. Yeah, he will be just like very, yeah, you know, we're kind of just doing this, and possibly, you know, this can lead to this, and it has these implications and whatnot. So the scientist will be capable of very, very nuanced positioning with regards to this particular thing. However, because the scientist is not a specialist in other fields, he mostly knows other fields through textbooks, or even through pop sci literature, or even through everyday discussions. So his modelings or ways of thinking about other phenomena or reality at large will be to a large extent determined by a certain, let's say, ideational milieu within which he is embedded. And this milieu will influence how he will interpret what he is doing in a larger scheme. However, at the same time, what he is doing very specifically will have a reverse effect on this larger milieu, but it will need a longer time to trickle into this milieu, and this milieu will change as well. Okay, does this make sense? So in a certain sense, you know, when you're putting on your researcher hat, you're basically in many ways discarding a lot of everyday scientific conceptions about the reality, because you know how messy everything is. However, when you put down the researcher hat and just put a general scientist hat, already you're talking more in lines of the mechanical worldview and whatnot. And then when you put that hat on and you put on, I'm a regular Joe, you know, then you will have stuff like, well, mind is just a computer, yeah? And you will be very, very schematic, and you will be very, very much in line with what's happening. Although the researcher hat, or what you're doing when you're wearing a researcher hat, might be something that will eventually undermine these other worldviews, but it will need, you know, decades or centuries for this to happen. So you always have like this, a complex dynamic system where you have something that's happening in the avant-garde trickling into the common views, but these common views affecting how this avant-garde is happening as well. So that's one way of a more complex way of looking at this as well, in a certain sense.
I agree, but I think there's a lot to discuss about this. You know, these kind of models, and you know, the relation to computation and mind and all this kind of stuff. So I'm, if I may, ask you a last question. So there's one sentence in this reading where it said that, I think it was McCulloch who said that there are no universals. Maybe I find the spot, and I didn't understand. I thought maybe somebody knows what he means by universals. Yeah.
Izak, will you respond to this?
Let's see.
I know I decided not to pay attention to that paragraph.
Yeah, I know. I can't remember specifically. I vaguely think that it has to do with.
I marked it.
How you get from like particularities to certain logical laws that are that have a general and universal validity. So if you have a brain that is, even if it's idealized, but it's still somehow embodied, what is it that allows you to get out of the temporality? So what allows you to get out of the specific and concrete spatiality and temporality? If you have a certain machine, it's always embedded into here and now, right?
Yeah.
So you need a certain element of something that allows you to provide for the universals that are atemporal. And I think that he mentions that he solved this by the circular loops, because the circular loops are something that take something from the outside and then basically can self-enclose. And in this way you can, if Izak, am I remembering this correctly?
Yeah, there's a quote I don't find now, that his original research question is how a man can know numbers.
Yeah.
And those
It's
are
somewhere
the
like that. Yeah.
exemplary universals. But I understood that he did not succeed in
He
doing
did
that.
not succeed. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. He was looking for ways, right, to do this.
So the universals are mentioned on 56,
Mm.
56.
but the quotes about numbers is somewhere before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is what I remember, the 56. Where he says that he tries to solve the problem with the circular causality, because these cycles, so the circular cycles, the causal cycles are the very means by which the sequences of events that reach the nervous system through the sense organs are captured and placed beyond the reach of time. So, you know, how do you find a way that you escape the particularity of the situation in a machine? Because if you have just a linear machine, it seems that it's always kind of conditioned by the context in which it is, and that's a very particular context. You cannot have generalities in it. So you need some sort of a mechanism or a system that would allow you to escape this contextuality. I think this is what the debate here was.
What I find incredibly fascinating is that's even worse than traditional psychologism in terms of logic. It's not even recognizing the rules of your own thought. It's basically just remembering how you've thought before.
Yeah.
So it's like you get from this friggin' complete critique of psychologism to when it's implemented enough, it simply becomes even a worse version of what they wanted to avoid.
But this is, I think, precisely why it says here, as you correctly pointed out, that he recognized the inadequacy of the 93 model in relation to one of his chief ambitions, to give an account of the capacity of the mind to form and know universals.
Yeah.
So he was not satisfied that he found the proper solution to this. But it's frustrating because it doesn't say much about it. He just says that this did not cause him to turn his back on the logic machine. Far from it, he tried everything he could to think of to make it more complex. But apparently he was unsuccessful.
But I found it particularly this, he says that the mind, the capacity of the mind to form universals and to
understand them.
Yeah. So it's,
I know.
and because there is this discussion, especially in modal epistemology, about universals. So with Armstrong, so he talks about structural universals. So this is why
So what are structural universals?
Structural. Oh, yeah, this would take very long to explain all this now.
But if you just simplify, like in the sense of just so that we have a vague idea about what would count as a structural.
You know, if you take H2O, this would be a structural universal.
Okay, I understand. So basically, that's the possible world thing, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh, we don't do this now, but you know, this. But I was thinking so that, you know, if he thinks about the mind to form these universals, so and to know them, so that has. I have to think.
I think that maybe I think that for him the universals would be even more abstract than that. Something like logical relations or or numbers,
Yeah.
probably, right?
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah.
Yeah, the quote about numbers is on page 51.
Yeah.
So you give the memorable formulation. What is a number? That a man may know it, and a man that he may know a number.
So then the number would be the universal.
Yeah.
And the person is made by the man, and the man is even in the position to know.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Okay. Yeah.
May I pose a question to Andrea? My impression of Dupuy's concept of model is that it's very French. It has so many faces. So I would like to ask you if you were, could you suggest what we should be looking for if we wanted to, for example, give a more analytic kind of explanation of all the ways he uses the concept of model for all the vague, inconcrete ways. For example, what are the main points that you would look for in a text if it was about models, since you're an expert in it?
I don't know how much I'm an expert in it, but he's talking a lot about models as representations, and he's talking about models in connection to simulations, and he's talking about abstraction and idealization, and these are the kind of keywords. Is this what you're asking for? So these are the things he's mentioning, and where I find him also, as Ty and I try to point out in the last session, he's even contradicting himself, when he's talking about models.
Mm-hmm.
So let me see.
Yeah, he's using it rather loosely, but I think that for me personally, the most useful descriptions were when he talks about formalization and idealization. So, and basically, Izak, the point that he's often making is very much Husserlian. Where Husserl does that spin with Galileo. So the famous thing is the following. There was a mathematization of science going on for quite some time, yeah, and basically science was becoming more and more mathematical, and the reality, it was the idea that reality or the world of phenomena is amenable to mathematical investigation and description was becoming more and more prominent. But Husserl says that with Galileo something really important happened, namely that the mathematization of the world happened in the sense that the idea was that the world was ontologically mathematical. So that basically the world of phenomena were always just an approximation of the world as it is, which is mathematical in nature. So the mathematical model, which is originally an idealization, because it is something that you will never be able to instantiate in phenomena as they give themselves to you in your experience, becomes the foundation in light of which the phenomena themselves are just mere approximations. So I think that Dupuy is often pointing to a similar thing. So you have a mathematical model, for instance, a model that is formalized and mathematized, and you can use it very usefully to account for certain phenomena that you're observing when you're talking about cognition and whatnot. But after a while, you say, well, this model, this idealized mathematical model, this is basically the true reality. And what you see is just like a reflection of it. So you say that the proper mind, when I look at the mind in human beings, when I look at the brains, it's messy. However, in itself, it's way more clear. It's neat. Yeah. If you have the proper conception of the machine, this is what mind really is somehow. So you have a similar spin happening. This is why he's constantly saying We're not dealing with the anthropomorphization of the machine. We're dealing with mechanization of the mind. So you have a concept of a machine which is formal, idealized, and then you basically try to show that it can be instantiated, and you don't succeed in that, but you think, okay, I'm going to ignore this. And then you say, well, given the fact that these machines exist, I will just say that the brain is the same, and that the mind is the same because it operates as a machine, as a formal machine. Yeah. So that's his point. So I think that the notions of formalization and idealization are the most important one in his understanding of the model.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, this connection to Husserl was what we were also talking last time about. To me, I wasn't quite clear. Then it became clear what was the equivalent, Dupuy's equivalent of the approximation procedure. But I think it's the development of logic, kind of a setting up of the how thought should appear,
Marvelous,
and
yeah.
the mathematization, mechanization. But he often, even if one reads him in this way, he often says he inverts the relationship. So for Neumann, it seemed more fruitful to try to enrich logic using neurophysiology as a model. So it's not as clear cut as with Husserl. That's why I'm asking if it's a complete pluralism of concepts of models, or
no. A useful hermeneutical pointer here would be the following. He would argue that for the most part, the cyberneticians were understanding model in this particular way, where you have the Husserlian understanding along the lines of Galileo. But Dupuy does not subscribe to that. He is trying to say that there are different ways of conceiving of model, and other people were kind of undermining what they were doing by reversing the direction, like von Neumann did. So for him, the relationship is way more complex. He's not going to claim that this is what models are like. He's going to claim this is one way of understanding what models do. Yeah, this is one way of thinking about models, which is, according to him, actually wrong. So Dupuy would not subscribe to this notion. He would say that the relationship is way more complex than that, but that this was the implicit or tacit model epistemology accepted by the vast majority of or at least the more prominent among the cyberneticians, at least McCulloch, and the line that developed out of him.
Actually, this is really good. If I may rephrase the question, if we wanted to get out to understand the alternative understandings of the concept of models, what should we be looking for? What concepts to connect to these alternative poles? Does he always kind of just, is his concept of model mainly about describing the cybernetic approach, and then sometimes using it in a different way? Or does he also later in the book kind of present his own theory of the model?
I can't remember clearly, but I think that he won't be, if I remember, I don't think that he will be developing like a theory of model of his own, but he will definitely try to show how you can look at it, understand it differently. So even if the models do what they do, for example, you might say, okay, models formalize and mathematize, but you can understand this very differently, as you know, Izak. So for example, if you understand mathematics and formalization very differently, all of a sudden the model itself will change. But if you have this idea of, so you can agree on what models are, so what the procedures are, but by understanding the dynamics that are involved differently, you get different understanding of models. So if you understand the process of formalization or the process of idealization differently, you will then get to a different notion of the model. Yeah? If mathematization is something that is somehow allowing you to account for the structure of reality, that's one way of thinking about it. But mathematization can also be seen as a practice which does a certain something, and you can move away from that particular position. So all of a sudden you have models that are of different nature. So, and I think that if I remember correctly, this is what he will be that what he will be doing. And also showing that, you know, if you have very specific philosophical presuppositions, these will feed into your models, and this is not trivial. So if you take a different approach, so instead of, say, the classical analytical philosophy of mind, you take phenomenology, all of a sudden you will have different parameters fed into your models on a very foundational level, and this will change the way you see. This is something that I was also kind of hinting at the very beginning when Andrea said that, you know, models are used for understanding. So what does understanding mean? And can you have a different type of understanding while still talking about models? Or do models necessarily require you to get into the domain where you know, try to find relations and...
Sorry.
It's no problem. I think that, yeah, we should slowly wrap this up anyway.
Just the last point. So I found it, you know, maybe it's along the line with what you were saying. So in the last chapter, he's referring to Hannah Arendt, and he's referring to her, to this Verum Factum, where she says, you know, we can only understand what we build. And I think this is very, for me, it's very important that, you know, we as humans, you know, we build models, and, you know, as you know, we do it in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
As you say, make different assumptions and so on and so on. And maybe there is the root of what Dupuy is, what he's trying to say, or what he's trying to do in this book.
Mm-hmm.
So we're pointing out, you know, we are doing, you know, this already becomes clear if we compare it with John von Neumann, McCulloch and Pitts and Wiener. They all had very different ways of constructing the models, and they came to different, and she's also talking about understanding here. So get to different understandings about the mind.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think for me, this was helpful last time, you know, because it's somehow, even, you know, he's using this notion of models, this idealization and abstraction. You know, idealization can be used differently by people like Michael Weisberg and so on. When they talk about idealization, then you put something into the model from which you know it's wrong, but it helps you to explore specific phenomena. So this is very different from what you describe when you look at Husserl.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, all interesting stuff. Okay, shall we wrap up? Yeah, is that okay? Okay, thank you very much. For me, this was a very useful discussion, to be honest, today. And also very interesting because, yeah, it's something that relates to a lot of stuff I'm currently also working on and thinking about. So we have another meeting in 2 weeks. Till then, be well, and looking forward to continuing this. So bye-bye. Ciao.